Hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 3 of an Unreal Engine design and world building series. Last week, we left off with a fairly decent pass of the interior's architecture, but it was lacking a lot of the interior details that make a house feel like a house. As well as that, it had almost no landscape outside. So that's what I've spent a lot of time doing this week, building a landscape outside and starting to flesh out some of the interior spaces with furniture and other models. It's been an enjoyable process. As well as that, I used this level for a slightly larger project that was incredibly exciting for me, and I'll show you a bit about that as well later. Here's a hint. So step 1 was to think about the way I wanted to start making the landscape. I didn't know if I needed to make some full hyper-detailed 3D models or if I could just get away with using some basic cards that would kind of hide themselves behind a bit of fog. So the first thing I did was start referencing some photos I'd taken on a holiday a couple of years ago and literally just stamped them onto really basic, quite horrible looking landscape planes. I quickly realised that that wasn't going to work, so I started looking at the idea of 3D modelling landscapes from scratch and then stamping details on them. This was probably a step in the right direction, but again, it wasn't giving me the kind of fidelity and resolution that I wanted, and it was probably going to take a little bit of time to start getting to the kind of landscape detail that I wanted. So, obviously, I started looking at procedural generation. This is a piece of software called Gaia. It's a procedural landscape generation tool that uses nodes and functions to help you build really interesting, detailed-looking landscapes. I started exploring ways to generate pieces of coastline inside Gaia and built a few prototype models that quickly started looking kind of how I wanted them to. By my third or fourth test, I had some really interesting looking cliffs that were kind of touching the sea with a bit of beach and some nice rolling hills on top. This is the kind of thing I was trying to go for, some nice kind of southern British coastline type landforms. And using Gaia and procedural generation, I was able to do this in quite a short amount of time. Once I'd settled on a shape, I rendered out a number of masks and overlays inside Gaia that would help me build some really detailed, interesting and varied textures later on in Substance Painter. Here you can see me overlaying various elements of texturing inside Substance Painter to create a really kind of nice, rich and varied cliffs environment. I wanted to get a lot of dirt inside those cliffs and also to make sure that the way the landscape touched the cliffs was fairly believable and realistic, but I needed to do this crucially in a way that wouldn't absolutely decimate my Unreal Engine scene with far too many polygons. So let's get it inside Unreal. And as the first piece of landscape was starting to come to Unreal, I was fairly happy with how it looked. It had a lot of detail, it looked good from a distance, and you could really see some of the cracks and crevices in the cliffs, which was great. From there, I started thinking about some of the other exterior elements of the scene, such as the stone walls surrounding the house. I found an old photo I'd taken on a holiday a couple of years ago again, of an old gnarled piece of cliff face, and using Substance Alchemist, very quickly turned it into a pretty decent looking texture, which had good height information, roughness information, and would work really well as a tiling texture for these pieces of stone wall. I very quickly modelled some basic damaged and old stone walls in 3ds Max and used this tiling texture I just made to stamp them on. They looked fairly basic in 3ds Max, but the second you got them into Unreal and used all of that normal and roughness information, they started looking pretty good and they sold themselves really well as a nice piece of old kind of stone wall. I used a very similar process for those bushes just behind. I needed some low poly bushes that you could see from a far way away, but you wouldn't really be getting too close to. And using again a very similar process, I built these fairly basic, fairly horrible to look at from close up bush assets that from far away looked like a decent hedge with a fair amount of depth information. You can see that for a lot of the landscape assets, the strategy that I'm taking is fairly low poly, fairly high in texture detail and fairly fast to make, because I did need to finish this scene fairly quickly, and I think it worked really well for a lot of the assets. The landscape itself is a very similar process. It's just an Unreal Engine landscape, and I used a similar tiling system in Substance Alchemist again to make the grass. I offset it a couple of times inside Unreal Engine using their texture system, and blended those offsets together using a noise I generated, and that kind of started to help get rid of some of the tiling. The next thing I did was start thinking about some of the other buildings that would surround this house. I really wanted to sell the idea that this was a piece of land inside a community and there were hundreds and hundreds of years worth of development and construction going on around. So the first thing I did was take an old castle kit that I built a few months ago and build an entire castle in it, over 100,000 polygons, which was far too many. So what I did was I merged them in a proxy merge, which is a great Unreal Engine way of generating a relatively low polygon model out of a much larger scene. I did this in another package and then just migrated it over, and here we go. An entire castle looking building that from up close is fairly jank around the edges, but from far away looks just fine, and it sells the idea that we've got neighbours. I took a very similar approach for the surrounding sci-fi buildings as well. I like the idea that this house was built, let's say 100 years or so from now, and so I wanted, despite this being a very grounded kind of British landscape, to be contrasted with some huge mega towers that would make this fairly sci-fi looking house kind of feel, more at home. So I took some assets again from another package that I built a few months ago and very quickly brought them over as a way to quickly get some fairly decent looking 3D skyscrapers in the background. And they look okay. Now I could spend all day modelling a city in the distance, but I just needed something that showed the idea of a kind of relatively advanced sense of development and construction in the surrounding area. And these assets worked absolutely perfectly for that. The next thing I did was start producing some of the interior elements in one long late night modelling session. A lot of it was similar things to what I've done before in this project, just basic box modelling and furniture modelling, but I did quite enjoy the way the bed turned out. I used a cloth modifier inside 3ds Max and yeah, it came out quite nicely in the end. Similar story for the bathroom sink, which again was a custom texture because I wanted to get some real sense of weathering and dirt on it, and it was a kind of centerpiece for the bathroom area. But again, it was a fairly fast thing to model and a fairly fast thing to texture, and the outcome wasn't too bad. So now let's jump back into Unreal. At this point I'd got a fair amount of furniture made, and I wanted to start rigging it up with things like physics. So for example, this piece of furniture is 2 pieces combined with a physics constraint, so it can actually spin properly. Most of my doors have been hooked up by this point as well, so they all had hinges, which was quite nice. And here you can see me just testing out some of those hinges by sending models through doors as fast as I could to make sure that they opened properly. Let's move over to the bathroom and bedroom area. So I did put a fair amount of time into this week, and I thought it turned out quite nicely in the end. I enjoyed the lighting, and also the bathroom it came out quite nicely. That floor sunken bath I was quite a fan of, and same that unit is absolutely fine. That ceiling is, well, it's something. It was an experiment, and I don't know whether or not I'd do it again, but it definitely does make you think about the room for a little bit longer than you've been inside it. So in that sense, it's a piece of architectural provocation. I quite like it. So now let's jump inside virtual reality and have a little explore around. The thing that immediately jumps out to me is the lighting. It's still very standard in this level, and I should definitely do a lighting and atmospherics pass at some point as well. I haven't talked about these trees too much because I think I need to redo them. They were a first attempt at learning to model them by hand, and whilst they're okay, they're not really production ready, so I will be having another look at some point. But let's jump inside. First thing I did obviously was start testing out all of the physics hinges. They work really well with a VR system if you've got a bit of physics enabled, and it's quite a lot of fun to start interacting with the house. It makes it start feeling more real and less of just a picture that you're looking at. So that was enjoyable. So now let's start heading to the area where inside we did the most work for this episode, and that is of course the bedroom areas. Barging my way through was an insane amount of fun. And yeah, I think the way this bedroom's come together works really nicely. I like those wall panels, and this bed feels like exactly the right size for quite a nice house like this. The view coming in with the large buildings across the water is really starting to work quite well, and the lighting of the room I'm quite enjoying. Some people might find the materials a little harsh, which I think is a fair enough comment, but I think for a sci-fi level that's kind of what I was trying to go for. I am a big fan of this bathroom as well now. It's come on really nicely. Again, that ceiling panel is definitely interesting, but it works quite well inside virtual reality because it kind of looms over you a tiny bit and really pushes you into the room. I think this freestanding bath here as well works quite nicely. Again, the scale's quite right. And yeah, I think the levels come together really nicely. I was having far too much fun with those physics doors as well. I don't know what this says about my world building, but it was one of my favourite parts of the project. So that's been the project this week. We started off with a fairly basic interior with some detail but not too much furniture and almost no landscape, and we've built a fairly interesting looking landscape and some fairly nice interior spaces. Now what I haven't done yet is start making the decisions that would really give this scene its own unique sense of character in terms of lighting and atmospherics. And there is a reason for that. I wanted it to be a blank template both for me to use for other projects but also for other people. And I spent a fair amount of my time over the last couple of weeks doing something special, which I'm going to give you a little hint of now and talk about in the next video in a lot more detail.
Hello there, and welcome to, well, I can't quite remember. I'm a partial digital scan of... Well, I can't remember that either. Look, to be honest, I could use a little bit of help. Inside this container is a small sphere. That's me, or at least it's part of me. If you can finish me, perhaps I'll be able to help you. I remember. I know where I am now.
Yeah, I used this game to build a short narrative VR experience. It was a hell of a journey, and I will tell you more about that in the next video. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Please do leave any comments you'd like to know more about, and I'll talk to you soon.